We're following efforts to clean up the Chesapeake Bay so future generations can enjoy it for many more years to come.
There is a rule in environmental science that sounds almost too obvious to question. If a river is polluted, you clean the river first. If a habitat is broken, you rebuild the habitat first. And only after that do you bring wildlife back. That is the normal order. That is the safe order. That is the order most people trust. So when a group of scientists chose to do the exact opposite, many people thought they were making a terrible mistake. Instead of waiting for clean water, they released thousands of young blue crabs into a river that had been written off by many as a damaged, stressed urban waterway. Not a beautiful coastal marsh, not a protected nursery, a toxic river, a river with a long history of pollution, a river where the habitat had been badly degraded, a river where life, especially young life, had a hard time surviving. To critics, the idea sounded reckless. To the team behind it, it was a calculated gamble, because they believed the real problem was not just pollution in the water. The deeper problem was that the river had stopped supporting the early life stages that kept the system alive. And if they could repair that broken cycle, maybe the river would not have to wait for perfection before recovery could begin. That was the theory. And what happened next forced people to look at restoration in a completely different way. To understand why this story matters, we have to start with the animal at the center of it all, the Atlantic blue crab. The blue crab is not just another species in the Chesapeake Bay region. It is one of the most important animals in the system, both ecologically and economically. It supports a major fishery, helps shape food webs, and depends heavily on nursery habitats like seagrass beds and other structured shallow areas when it is young. Recent reporting from Maryland's Blue Crab Winter Dredge Survey shows that the Chesapeake population remains under pressure, with total abundance down to 238 million in 2025, the second lowest estimate in the history of the survey, and juvenile abundance also falling. That matters because when a species like this struggles, the effects move outward in every direction. Fisheries feel it, watermen feel it, predators feel it, the habitat feels it, and slowly, the whole estuary starts losing part of its balance. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, blue crab managers and researchers were already dealing with serious concerns. Overharvest had been one issue, especially pressure on spawning females. But habitat loss and poor juvenile survival were also critical. Even when adult crabs were present, too many young crabs were dying before they could grow into the next generation. That meant the population could appear to exist on the surface while quietly weakening underneath. And few places showed that breakdown more clearly than urban tributaries like the Lafayette River. The Lafayette River is part of the Elizabeth River system in Virginia. Today, it is often presented as a restoration success story. But that came after years of damage and years of work. The Elizabeth River Project says the tributary has since benefited from more than $200 million in water treatment and municipal sewer repairs, and now hosts about 80 acres of healthy oyster habitat, including a major reef seeded with millions of oysters. That did not happen overnight. It happened because the river had first become a symbol of how much damage an urban waterway could absorb before it started to fail. In simple terms, Lafayette had become a difficult place for young animals to survive. Nutrient pollution feeds algae blooms. Poor water clarity reduced plant growth. The bottom habitat became more exposed, and the safe, complex nursery spaces that small crabs needed were disappearing. For a juvenile blue crab, that is a disaster. Young blue crabs do not just need water. They need cover, structure, and places to vanish. Without those places, they become food. And one of the biggest threats does not even come from fish. It comes from other crabs. Cannibalism is a major source of juvenile mortality in blue crabs. Smithsonian research has shown that larger crabs can account for most of the deaths of smaller juveniles in some shallow areas, and that structured habitats like seagrass or other refuge areas are essential because they reduce that deadly exposure. In other words, when habitat disappears, the system does not simply become less healthy. It becomes far more dangerous for the next generation. That is the key to this entire story. The scientists were not just asking whether adult crabs could tolerate bad water. They were asking whether the real bottleneck was happening much earlier. In the wild, blue crabs begin life in a brutal system. Their larvae are tiny, fragile, and vulnerable to currents, predators, and environmental stress. Very few survive to later stages, even under normal conditions. In a degraded river, those odds can get even worse. So researchers started asking a different question. What if the way to help the population was not to fix every problem first, but to help crabs get past the most dangerous stage of life? That idea led to stock enhancement. The basic concept sounds simple. Raise young crabs in controlled conditions. Protect them during the most fragile stage. Then release them when they are bigger, stronger, and more likely to survive. But in practice, that is incredibly hard. Blue crabs are not easy to hatch in a hatchery. They are aggressive and territorial, and they will eat each other. That is one reason hatchery work on this species has always been so challenging. You are not raising a calm, passive animal. You are trying to mass produce a predator without letting that predator destroy itself before release. Reviews of blue crab enhancement work in Chesapeake Bay emphasized how difficult the species is to rear and how important it is to understand both carrying capacity and nursery habitat before assuming releases will succeed. So the hatchery phase had to be precise. Temperature had to be managed carefully. Light cycles had to mimic natural conditions. Food had to match what the animals needed at each stage. Density had to be controlled to reduce cannibalism. And artificial structures had to be used to create space and lower conflict. This was not just raising animals. It was engineering survival. And even if the hatchery team did everything right, there was still a bigger question waiting in the river. Would hatchery-reared crabs actually know how to be wild? Critics thought the answer was probably no. From their point of view, these crabs were sheltered. They had not grown up dodging predators in a rough estuary. They had not learned to forage in a chaotic environment. They had not experienced tidal shifts, low oxygen events, or exposed bottom habitat. So the criticisms came from several directions at once. Some people thought the project would waste money. Some thought the crabs would be eaten almost immediately. Some worried about the disease. Some worried about genetic effects. And others believed the river itself was still too damaged for any release to matter. Those concerns were not imaginary. They reflected the mixed global record of stock enhancement and the fact that releasing hatchery animals into wild systems can create real biological risk. Chesapeake-focused reviews also stressed that the success of blue crab enhancement would depend heavily on whether the habitat could actually support the released animals. But the team moved forward. And one reason this story stands out is that the release was not based on blind faith. It was built around data. The scientists did not just want to make a symbolic release and hope for good headlines. They wanted to know whether the crabs could feed, whether they could move normally, whether they could survive long enough to matter, and whether certain habitats improve their chances. So they tagged crabs, monitored survival, and compared different environments. And almost immediately, one of the most important assumptions of the critics started to fall apart. The crabs were not helpless. They were feeding. They were moving. They were behaving like crabs. That matters because it suggests something powerful. Much of the behavior a blue crab needs for survival is instinctive, not something that depends entirely on growing up in the wild. But another lesson soon became even bigger. Water chemistry was not the whole story. Habitat structure mattered enormously. This is where oyster reefs enter the picture. Oyster reefs are some of the most valuable natural structures in estuarine systems. NOAA notes that restored oyster reefs do more than just support oysters themselves. They filter water, remove nutrients, create habitat for many species, and improve survival for juvenile blue crabs. In one study highlighted by NOAA, juvenile crabs had 3 to 4 times better odds of surviving predators on a reef than on a sandy bottom. That single point changes how you see the crab experiment. The scientists were not simply dumping crabs into toxic water and hoping for a miracle. They were testing whether life could regain traction if enough refuge and structure existed to support it. That is a very different idea, because a flat, exposed bottom and a structured reef are not the same world for a small crab. On bare bottom, a juvenile is visible, vulnerable, and easy to catch. On a reef, the same juvenile suddenly has cracks, edges, shadows, and escape space. Research in Chesapeake systems has repeatedly reinforced this idea. Structured habitats like oyster reefs and seagrass beds act as refuge from predators, especially from larger cannibalistic crabs. That is one reason restoration planners increasingly see habitat structure as central, not optional, in rebuilding crab nurseries. And the Lafayette was becoming a place where that theory could actually be tested in the real world. Oyster restoration in the Lafayette River expanded over time and became one of the river's major recovery stories. The Elizabeth River Project reports that the tributary now contains around 80 acres of healthy oyster habitat, and Chesapeake Bay restoration updates have highlighted the Lafayette as one of Virginia's leading oyster restoration success stories. That means the crab releases were not happening in isolation. They were interacting with a broader landscape that was slowly regaining complexity. That broader context matters, because no serious restoration story is ever about one action alone. It is about layers. The crabs mattered. The habitat mattered. Water treatment investments mattered. Sewer repairs mattered. Community engagement mattered. And once those layers started aligning, the river began to look less like a lost cause and more like a system that could still respond. That response was not instant, and it was not magical, but it was real. The value of the experiment was not that it solved every problem forever. It was that it proved that the river still had biological potential. That is a huge difference. In restoration, proof changes everything. It changes how funders think, how agencies think, and how residents think. And in Lafayette, public involvement became part of the recovery story too. The Elizabeth River Project says thousands of residents joined its River Star Homes program, while broader public and infrastructure investment helped reduce pollution at the source. A river that once symbolized damage began to become a place people actively wanted to restore. That social shift is easy to overlook, but it may be one of the most important outcomes of all. Because rivers are rarely damaged by just one event. They are damaged by repetition, habit, infrastructure, and years of small decisions that all move in the wrong direction. So when people see visible recovery, they stop seeing the river as a permanent failure, and that can change behavior. Now, to be clear, this is not a fairy tale ending. Blue crabs in Chesapeake Bay are not saved forever. Recent survey data show the population remains unstable, and juvenile abundance continues to be a major concern. The 2024 survey estimated 317 million crabs, and the 2025 survey dropped to 238 million, with juvenile numbers also lower in 2025. So the modern lesson is not that one experiment permanently solved the species' problems. The lesson is that targeted intervention can work under the right conditions, especially when combined with habitat structure and larger restoration efforts. And honestly, that truth is more useful than a fairy tale, because it tells us what restoration really looks like. Not one dramatic act, not one perfect fix, but a chain of informed actions. The crab releases helped address a bottleneck. The oyster reefs helped create a refuge. Water quality work improved broader conditions. Community action reduced continued damage. That is how systems begin to turn. This story also forces a harder question. For a long time, many people treated leave nature alone as the purest environmental principle. And sometimes it is. But rivers like the Lafayette were not left alone in the first place. They were altered, polluted, hardened, and stressed for years. In that kind of system, waiting passively for full recovery can become its own form of inaction. Sometimes the ecosystem is declining too fast. Sometimes, if you wait for everything to be perfect, you are no longer restoring anything. You are simply documenting the loss. That is why this crab story matters so much. It is not really about whether crabs are interesting. It is about whether restoration has to wait for ideal conditions. And in this case, the answer seems to be no. Sometimes the first step is not perfection. Sometimes the first step is to rebuild function, to restore a missing stage, to provide refuge, to create a bridge across the part of the life cycle that keeps failing. That is what made this experiment so powerful. They released thousands of crabs into a toxic river. At first, many people saw only the risk, only the pollution, only the possibility of failure. But what they missed was the bigger idea underneath it all, that a damaged ecosystem can still respond if you help life get past the point where it keeps breaking. And that may be the most important lesson here. Not that intervention always works. Not that every species should be stocked. Not that every damaged river can be repaired the same way. But ecosystems are often waiting at a bottleneck. And if you identify that bottleneck correctly, you may be able to unlock recovery much sooner than anyone expects. So in the end, the result did not shock people because every problem disappeared. It shocked people because the river answered back. The crabs did not simply vanish. The system did not simply reject them. And the science did not collapse under the weight of its own ambition. Instead, the experiment helped open a door to a more active, more strategic version of restoration. One where species recovery, habitat recovery, water quality work, and community action are not separate stories. They are the same story. And maybe that is the biggest takeaway of all. Sometimes a river does not need us to wait. Sometimes it needs us to understand exactly where life is failing and be bold enough to help it start again. But there is one more layer to this story that often gets overlooked, and it might be the most important one. This experiment was not just about crabs. It was not just about one river. It was about uncertainty. Because in environmental science, we are often working with systems we don't fully control. We deal with incomplete data. We deal with changing conditions. And we deal with decisions that carry real consequences. That is why many restoration strategies lean toward caution. Wait for better data. Wait for cleaner water. Wait for safer conditions. But sometimes, waiting becomes a problem of its own. Because ecosystems don't pause while we think. They continue to decline. They continue to lose species. They continue to drift further away from recovery. And at some point, doing nothing becomes its own risk. That is what makes this case different. The scientists did not ignore the risks. They understood them. But they also understood something else. That intervention, when guided by data and focused on the right problem, can create momentum. Not instant success, not perfect results, but movement. And in a collapsing system, movement can be enough to change the outcome. So maybe the lesson here is not that we should always act fast. And it's not that we should always intervene. The real lesson is this: we need to understand where the system is breaking and be willing to act at that exact point. But restoring one critical step can be enough to bring everything else back. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe this kind of intervention is exactly what damaged ecosystems need? Or do you think the risks are still too high? And if you want more stories where science, nature, and unexpected results collide, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.